This is Judith Stove from Sydney, Australia, and you are listening to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast.
Welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast, a podcast dedicated to exploring the applied philosophy of traditional Stoicism. The College of Stoic Philosophers is an online school founded in 2008. We at the college endeavor to educate all who would be Stoics and Stoic philosophers who aspire to the good life within the world community. Podcast episodes will include discussions of Stoic history, application, interviews, and much more, all while having some fun, fate permitting. I'm your host, Mark Sterry. Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Judith Stove, welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. How's it going today there, Judith?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. It's great here today in Sydney, Australia. It's nice and hot, a bit warmer than what you're having over there, I think.
I bet, yes. When people come on the podcast, I do ask what the weather is. And I learned that from Eric Wiegard, who was the original scholar of the College of Stoic Philosophers. And it was just a great way to kick off the conversation and see where people are coming from.
Yep, it's very hot today. It's going to be over 40 degrees where I live. So that's in Celsius. Anyway, it's just going to be really hot.
Okay. We are here in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Just a little above freezing, but it feels like spring because the last few days it's been literally 15 below zero before the wind chill. So today is just a gift from the cosmos. It is just gorgeous at 38 degrees here in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Well, that's right. All our weather is that gift from the cosmos, and looking out on a beautiful view of a tree that's in full flower at the moment. So what's not to like?
I hear you. Judith is one of my students with the Stoic Cosmic Consciousness course. And so I've been studying up on you today, Judith. She was just an excellent student, and I'll get into why she's on the podcast. But a little bit about you I found online. Judith is an Australian writer, researcher, and linguist with a strong understanding of the Western philosophical tradition, along with the ancient languages of Latin and Classical Greek. Is that the right person I'm looking up, Judith?
Yep, that's me. I wouldn't say I'm a linguist, and I haven't studied at postgraduate level, but I do have an honours degree in Latin and Classical Greek. But I'm also interested in literatures of all kinds, particularly the English tradition.
That's great. And so recently the college, I developed a course called the Stoic Cosmic Consciousness course. And Judith is one of the first students that took it when it went public. And it's a course about kind of Stoics' relationship with panpsychism, pantheism, and all the stuff around that. Judith, how did you discover that course?
Well, it actually just popped up in my Facebook feed, Mark, and it kind of came at a very opportune moment for me because I've been thinking about these issues to do with the Stoic view of the cosmos, how it meshes or doesn't mesh with some of our scientific views today, all these issues around interconnectedness, the body and the mind. And, I'm sure it was the cosmos just bringing this to my attention at the right moment because it just came along when I was ready for it. I committed, and honestly, I love this course. I congratulate you on it, Mark. The readings are illuminating. The opportunities for the students to go and seek out their own resources is also a great exercise to reflect on them. There's plenty of opportunity for reflection and coming to your own views about what the material that you're looking at and just the breadth that's covered. So, for instance, one of the philosophers we looked at was David Chalmers, who's an Australian philosopher who's had a really outsized impact on philosophy of mind in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, into the 21st century. And just coming across his work was so important. Philip Goff, who's another British philosopher whose work we study in the course, that was also a revelation to me. His wonderful book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, from 2023. That was fantastic. It brought so many of these very complex ideas into a really accessible format. So, yeah, it's a wonderful course. I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested in looking perhaps a little more broadly at the Stoic worldview and situating it in other important philosophical developments of our time.
Thank you, Judith, for that endorsement. I definitely appreciate it. It was a labor of love for sure. How I developed the course was back when I took physics with Eric Wiegard, the original scholar of the college years ago. my aha moment, we sometimes say, when I really bought into or really started to get the Stoic view of physics, is he was talking that the Stoics, in his opinion at the time, I'm sure it changed by now, he thought they were panpsychists or very like panpsychists. And I started researching that, and he said it was kind of an ugly word and hard to remember, and I agree with him a little bit on that, but it was just this huge aha moment. And on my own time, just started studying Philip Goff, who's one of my favorite writers. Galileo's Error was his first book that I came across, and happened to hear him on a number of podcasts and YouTube videos, and just wanted to kind of try to figure out what the Stoics' viewpoint was. And then officially, apparently, they're called pantheists. And so there's a great Harrison book that I don't know how great it is, but I thought it was a good introduction to pantheism. And the whole course is just the folks, the students wrestling with these ideas, become exposed to a variety of these household name philosophers like David Chalmers, Philip Goff, and even our current scholar, Chris Fisher, on there with the Stoic perspective. And then by the end, the students take what they learned and complete a project, either a paper or what you did, Judith. Judith made a beautiful video, and it was just jaw-dropping, and I really appreciate the hard work and effort. When I came across, I'm like, this needs to be shared. You're an insightful person and just did a great job with it. So that's why for the podcast, the second half of this is going to be playing the audio from Judith's video, so you guys can hear what she came up with taking this Stoic Cosmic Consciousness course. And thought I'd do a little interview with you ahead of time to kind of see, get your background and to see who you are or whatever. I guess let me ask you, how did you come across Stoicism in the first place?
Okay, so I've mentioned I studied Latin and Classical Greek at university at undergraduate level, honours level, we call it here in Australia. And I always loved the ancient world. You know, even as a little girl, I just wanted to read the Greek legends, and I was just fascinated with the culture. So I always knew I wanted to study the ancient world in some form. But, you know, kind of life intervened, marriage, jobs, kids. I was lucky enough, though, in the early 2000s to be invited to take part in a research project, and that was being run by Professor James Franklin, who was my dad's literary executor. And Jim Franklin, if people want to look him up, he's an Australian mathematician, historian of science, philosophy, historian of philosophy as well. He's kind of a polymath, you know, he can do everything. And Jim was kind enough to invite me. He'd seen some of my writing. He invited me onto this project, which was investigating the history of the virtue of self-control. And unfortunately, the project never eventuated into a book, but we did some articles, and I was involved in researching. And so I started to read Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and the Epicureans. And I was just delighted to be back into looking at those authors. And it seemed to me at that stage, with the way I was thinking about it, that and so this is, as I say, in the early 2000s. It was before kind of Stoicism had its revival. But I was already thinking, well, actually, ancient virtue ethics is a viable worldview, even in our day and age. You know, it's a way to live that's structured. It's got moral frameworks. And I was really attracted to that then. So life went on. I was writing about other things, mainly about English literature. Jane Austen is another of my topics. And then in February 2020, my husband and I were travelling to Istanbul, the old Constantinople, and I actually came down with chickenpox in Istanbul, and so we were stuck in a small apartment in Istanbul. I didn't know if I was going to get really sick or if my husband gets sick. I happened to have brought with me Seneca's Letters. I just grabbed it off the shelf as we'd been leaving, and suddenly it was the perfect thing for that environment. You know, we'd kind of been, I think before the pandemic, we were maybe in a bit of a fool's paradise, forgetting that plague, exile, isolation, all those things were actually the historic norm, not the exception. And there it was, all in Seneca. And so he was a great comfort to me in that period. And then, of course, a few weeks later, with the pandemic hitting around the world, we kind of all learnt these ancient truths over again. And later in that year, back in Australia, I got involved with some Stoic groups online. We put together the first Australian Stoicon, which was all online in November that year. It was great fun. We had a ball. And since I've been involved in Stoic on X Melbourne, which we've had now 4 in-person events since the end of the pandemic. We've had speakers such as Donald Robertson, Brittany Palat, We've had William O. Stevens, figures who are involved in the modern Stoicism movement. And it's a great way of bringing together people who are interested. And finally, the last piece of the puzzle for me was that I think in 2022, I was asked to come onto the editorial team for Stoicism Today, which is the online journal of the modern Stoicism team. So I'm assistant editor there. And that's been great to be able to bring to and share people's reflections on Stoicism. We publish a whole range of items. We publish poems, we publish memoirs, as well as more straightforward essays and articles. So that's how I kind of got back into Stoicism or into Stoicism. It kind of fulfilled the chord, if you like, or made a harmony with other elements in my life from the very beginning.
And you do some work with podcasting as well. Don't you co-host Soul Searching with Seneca with Simon Drew? Because I heard this story this morning. I was listening to your podcast with him, and I was going to ask you about that flight when you had chicken pox and rediscovered your love of Seneca. And agree with it, too. When my father passed away a few years back, I found a lot of comfort in Seneca's letters, and I'm not sure how I would have responded to it without it. He was he didn't have that harshness of Epictetus. He was more of a kind of a therapist and understanding, and I just think he's an excellent guy, a little more sensitive to those situations.
I totally agree. I think Epictetus is a lot of people's introduction into Stoicism, but he's a really harsh teacher, He's a great teacher, but he's a harsh teacher. Seneca kind of eases you in a bit more. And Seneca's he's got such variety in his writing that whenever you pick him up, there's something there that you can take away that is worth thinking about, and as you say, will give you comfort. So yes, to your point with I have been involved with Simon. Our podcast has kind of been a bit of a hiatus at the moment, but yeah, it's been wonderful. We've worked through, I think we're up to letter 60 something, and we're just going from start to finish. But doing that slow exploration has been so enriching, certainly for me, because I've appreciated Seneca at another level. He was not only drawing out some of these aspects of Stoicism, but he was also kind of translating into Latin for the first time, well, maybe not quite for the first, because Cicero had done it a bit beforehand, but bringing in Plato's ideas and putting them from Greek into Latin. So he was kind of a real pioneer, if you like, of cultural transmission of so many philosophical ideas. And so reading Seneca is just like, it's like a philosophical education. He also brings in ideas from Epicurus. He's not exclusive about it. He's very inclusive. He brings in so many ideas and interprets them in a thoughtful way.
For people that do listen to the podcast, you did mention your father, and recently the founder, again mentioning Eric Wiegard, was on, and you were listening, and he talked about starting the College of Stoic Philosophers, and had assistance from Keith Campbell. And you sent me an email about you mentioned your father's relationship with Keith Campbell, your father, David Stove. Do you mind talking about that just a little bit for the listeners that heard that episode?
Sure. So my father, David Stove, was an Australian philosopher at the University of Sydney for much of his working life. It's fair to say he was a polarising figure. He did do important work in, and again, I'm kind of relying a bit on Jim Franklin, who was his literary executor, this friend of ours, and great academic as well. Jim tells us that my dad's best contribution, perhaps, to philosophy is his work on probability and induction. Now, I'm not qualified to comment on that, but I know my dad was also interested in the Hellenistic philosophers to an extent, and yes, he was great friends with Professor Keith Campbell, a member of the same philosophy department, and Keith was a pioneer of bringing the Hellenistic philosophers back into kind of serious academic consideration, because it's hard for us to even understand how forgotten or kind of neglected the Hellenistic philosophers were in the Anglosphere, in the English-speaking world, for much of the 20th century, really. And I'll just give one example of that to maybe illustrate it. One of the articles that I've written, and it was a project together with another Australian called Chris Lee, was about a philosopher called Jason Xenakis. And if people are interested, they can find the articles if they go to Stoicism Today, which is the online journal of the modern Stoicism movement. Stoicism Today has a search bar. If people are interested, they can put in Xenakis, and that's spelled Xenakis. Now, we did 2 articles about Jason Xenakis, and he was a philosopher who produced the first monograph in English about Epictetus. Now, that came out in 1969, and Xenakis was working with, the last real work on Epictetus had been Oldfather in the 1920s. So that goes to show between the 1920s and the 1960s, in English-speaking world, there was nothing on Epictetus. And that kind of illustrates the extent to which he was neglected. Seneca, for his part, if you look at papers from the 1970s, it's just like, we know this guy had a great reputation for 2,000 years. We just don't kind of see why, because he seems like a terrible person and his work's too rhetorical. And so people just, for much of the 20th century in the English-speaking world, people didn't get the Stoics. Now, so I'm just coming back to my dad and Keith Campbell. I did come across, in my dad's books after he passed, years after he passed, he had an edition of, a collected edition of the Hellenistic philosophers. So it had all the surviving Epicurus fragments. It had the Epictetus works in Long's translation. It had Marcus Aurelius. And so I think my dad, and certainly Keith Campbell, I think they kind of got it, even in this very inhospitable environment where people just didn't get the Hellenistic philosophers. But yeah, I think they did. And certainly, yes, it was just wonderful to hear about Keith Campbell again, because he was a family friend. And I've just started going back, looking at some of his work on the Hellenistic philosophers. And again, yeah, he was ahead of his time. Keith Campbell was writing about the Stoics in a way that really has only come back into fashion in probably, I would say, in the last 10 years. So yeah, thinking about all these connections has been so enriching. So thank you for the opportunity to do that.
As we say in small town Wisconsin, what a small world.
I know, right?
Wow.
but that's Stoicism. Stoicism brings people together across the cosmos.
Yes, it does. Once we mentioned, so you've written a book on Jane Austen, and your second book's about to come out, The Legacies of Marcus Aurelius. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that? But I'd love to do the show with you later on down the line, specifically on the book. But can you give us just a little tidbit to what to expect from that?
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity, Mark. Yeah, so I've actually written 2 books about Jane Austen's life and times, so this forthcoming one is my third. I'm hoping it's coming out in April, and it's called Marcus Aurelius and His Legacies, Seeking Rome's Kingdom of Gold. Now, I took that line, it's actually in one of the historians, the major sources for Marcus's life, a man called Cassius Dio, who was a much younger contemporary, and it may have actually been his life may have overlapped with Marcus's. And there's a great sentence in Cassius Dio where he says that on Marcus's death in 180, Rome went from a kingdom of gold to one of rust and iron. And he means that when Commodus came to the throne, everything went bad. And it's such a beautiful expression. And so I went looking through history for these traces of Marcus's kingdom of gold. Having said that, kind of the Stoics got really a bit lost in the English-speaking world, and Marcus most of all, I would say, I started to realise there were these little traces to show that maybe his influence on Western culture had actually been hiding there in plain sight. And the first one I found, and I published this, I think, in 2022, again in Stoicism Today, was that the great English novelist Daniel Defoe, who wrote what's called the first English novel, Robinson Crusoe, everyone knows the story of Robinson Crusoe, from 1719, Defoe actually plagiarized Marcus Aurelius' Meditations extensively in another work that Defoe published in that same year, 1719, published anonymously. But yeah, I was kind of the first person to pick that up and realize these verbal echoes, or actually copyings. I picked that up, first person after 300 years, because a lot of people have taken that work of Defoe's and they've attributed it to all kinds of other origins. And I looked at it and thought, hang on, that's actually Marcus's actual words. So that was the first thing. So that was, and there were a couple of other things, and I'll just mention one. There's a part of my research came across a beautiful book from the 12th century. It's called the Mirabilia Urbis Romae, the marvels of the city of Rome. And it talks about the great equestrian statue of Marcus, the most iconic image of him. And of course, it survived from antiquity because some people thought it was actually of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. And really, that's the kind of an illustration of how much Marcus had been forgotten. But I did find in this little book there was a legend about a virtuous knight called Marcus associated with the equestrian statue. So it seemed to me that was a little echo of Marcus in material culture as well. So that's kind of what my book tries to do. It tries to bring all these threads together and find Marcus hiding in plain sight throughout Western history.
That sounds fascinating. I can't wait for that to come out. Congratulations on that, and thank you for doing that. And I hope you consider coming on the podcast again, specifically to talk more about it after I've had a chance to read it. Well, hopefully it comes out in April, and that is outstanding. One more question before we move on to your project. So you're an expert on Jane Austen, and I love classic literature. Does any of her works reflect any Stoicism or Stoic traits?
Thanks for asking about Jane Austen, Mark. I would say yes and no. So no, because in the sense that there's no direct links at all to Stoicism. There's not even any direct links to any ancient philosophy, even though some scholars have said that Jane Austen is an Aristotelian. There's actually no evidence for that either. But yes, in the sense that her whole culture was infused with virtue ethics, in a sense. So yes, she is a virtue writer. She writes about how important it is for, particularly, of course, young women, but also for men, to put true values, that is virtues, ahead of personal gain or false friendships or false relationships in general and false values. So yes, she's a virtue writer. No, unfortunately, she's not a Stoic writer.
Eventually, I'm going to do a podcast about top 5 Stoic books of all time. And so that's going to be interesting to see what classic folks have any dealings with Stoicism as well. So we'll move on without further ado. Do you mind setting us up before we play your audio from the video made? What were you thinking? How did you come up with this great project for Stoic Cosmic Consciousness course?
Well, thank you, Mark. I came up with this idea when I literally was, as I say in the start of the video, sitting in my annual CPR refresher training to learn how to revive people who are unconscious and not breathing. What do? Well, we don't slap them around the head. we put pressure on their chest area. And I started thinking about, well, the Stoics have had a bad rap over the generations, particularly from people like Galen, who was Stoic adjacent, but not a Stoic, he was a Platonist. And our culture has generally gone to a very cephalocentric, I would say, so putting our minds and brains front and centre view of the human person. But the Stoics didn't have that. They put the centre of the human person in the mid-body. And that's what my presentation explores. So I look at things like, as I said, Galen, Plato and Aristotle, and some fairly strange ideas about the human person which have come forward in more recent times. So I hope you enjoy it. And thanks for the opportunity, Mark. And I'd love to come back on the podcast at a later date. Hi, my name's Judith Stove. I've been undertaking the Stoic Cosmic Consciousness course with the College of Stoic Philosophers. And this is my presentation, Hearts and Minds, the Stoics and Neuroscience. The seed of this presentation germinated, so to speak, for me as I recently undertook my annual refresher training in cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR. 2 things, in fact, occurred to me. The first is that this technique, surprisingly in view of how low-tech it is, only emerged in the 19th century, and more on that later. And second, that maybe the ancient Stoic views on the roles of the heart have more merit than they have often received. So famously, the ancient Stoics considered that the heart, not the head, was the seat of key human functions which nowadays are generally considered mental or psychological, such as cognition and speech. And a key text here is the Diogenes Laertius quote, "By ruling part, hegemonikon, is meant that which is most truly soul proper, in which arise impressions and drives, and from which emerges rational speech. And it is located in the heart, in cardiae." Now, the Stoics weren't the first to have thought this. In Homeric literature, the soul was associated with emotions such as courage in battle, and therefore may be thought to have grasped what courage is, so kind of cognitive as well as emotional. And there was also an idea of action. So here we find the great Hector having his heart likened to an axe shaping the timbers of a ship. It gives the impression of the heart as the seat of activity as well as emotion and cognition. Plato's treatments remained key. In the Phaedo, Socrates claims that it is soul in a body which makes it living. In the Timaeus, Plato conjectured that the soul had three parts. An immortal kind, located chiefly in the head, a mortal one subject to passions and desires, located in the chest, and a third and inferior kind associated with pleasures and pains, located in the midriff. So it's important to note how many different roles and functions, voluntary, physical, involuntary, cognitive, emotional, are implicated in the tripartite framework. For his part, Aristotle would locate the perceptive capacity of the soul and the function of nutrition in the middle of the body, that's to say in the heart. Once again, the key processes are recorded at a specific location. Aristotle added evidence from embryo studies that often, in many species, the heart is the first organ to develop in embryo. So the Stoics were drawing on existing traditions. Cleanthes, we are told, brought forward arguments about heat involved in processes such as digestion and circulation. Cicero tells us on the nature of the gods. This doctrine Cleanthes enforces by these further arguments to show how great is the supply of heat in every living body. Again, the veins and arteries never cease throbbing with a flame-like pulse, quasi quodam igneo motu, and frequent cases have been observed when the heart of an animal, on being torn out of its body, has continued to beat with a rapid motion resembling the flickering of fire. Motion, nutrition, and growth, heat, and all these phenomena for the Stoics were intimately involved with life, wherever manifested throughout the world. Just as heat was found everywhere, so was reason in various forms, from the simpler organisms through to humans and gods. The cosmos as a whole was unified by the all-pervasive rational breath, pneuma, distributed throughout in a complete blend. Now, processes such as growth and change also imply development towards a goal, and nature's goals cannot be impeded overall, we are told, again by Cicero. Today's scientists, and even most philosophers, would doubtless reject the idea that nature has a goal. In fact, some prominent theorists have even rejected the notion of nature in the post-Darwin world. Yet surely, if the evolutionary view of life, the development and adaptation of species via natural selection is true at all, it's true universally. We can follow the ancient Stoics in taking a unified view of recurrent cosmic processes, including those involved in the evolution of plant and animal species. The Stoic view also affords a unifying account of why we sometimes experience a physical symptom prior to a conscious response. The proto-passions are those first movements which the Stoics considered even the sage would undergo: vertigo at a height, or dismay or revulsion on seeing gruesome injuries, as Seneca's Letters has it. Sometimes we're moved to tears as we witness an affecting scene or event, whether that's in real life or in a book or a movie or in a piece of music. These are aspects of being human, and it's also human to bring reason to bear with a more considered and constructive response. Thus, the Stoic view insisted that the physical and the cognitive operate within a close nexus, not, as Plato had insisted, through separate kinds of soul. We see a highly perceptive account which demonstrates the Stoic insistence on the integration of the physical and the cognitive in Seneca's Letter 50. Seneca describes Harpaste, whose name I think means seized, acquired with violence, a vulnerable enslaved woman bequeathed to Seneca's wife and given by them a home and a carer. Harpaste had worked as an in-house entertainer, a practice which Seneca, he writes, detested, but now was affected by a condition in which she was losing her vision, but at the same time unable to recognise the disability. She complains instead that her rooms are too dark. Seneca's close and compassionate observation stands as the first known account of the rare neurological condition Anton syndrome, which combines vision and or hearing loss with unawareness of it, leading to fabulation. Seneca deploys this as a powerful metaphor more generally, underscoring each person's cognition as radically conditioned within their bodily and social setting. As he writes, "For what is the mind?" That's animus in Seneca's Latin, other than breath, spiritus in Latin, which is equivalent to Greek pneuma, disposed in a certain way. The doctor and philosopher Galen, contemporary and associate of Marcus Aurelius, was well known as a strong critic of Stoic views, in particular the location of the hegemonikon in the heart. Galen, by contrast, preferred a Platonist view. However, as Christopher Gill has shown, Galen shares some aspects of Stoic theory, such as overall naturalism about human psychology, and seems to accept their account of a blending of corporeal elements. Galen developed sophisticated accounts of the actions of the heart and lungs. According to Gill, the main point of contention was whether embryo development supported the situation of the deliberative element of soul in the heart. Galen's view of that the liver developed prior to the heart seems to have formed his commitment to a tripartite model with roles for liver, heart and brain. Galen's view was that the seat of anger, as the heart as the seat of anger or the liver as seat of desire, could neither be the motivator of action, leaving only the brain as the agent. Gill, for his part, concludes, Galen's theory would have benefited if he had formed a view of the role of the brain as more like the Stoic heart, that is, as the seat of reason, emotion and desire, conceived as functions of a single directing organ and psychological agency. And that's from Gill's excellent article, Galen and the Stoics, Mortal Enemies or Blood Brothers, from 2007. A cardiocentric view, probably inherited from Aristotle, remained the dominant framework until the 17th century, or in fact, probably until the 19th century. In the 17th was when William Harvey, in his work from 1628, De Motu Cordis, on the movement of the heart, established the circulation of the blood. Yet by the later 20th century, views of the human person tended to be shaped in the cephalocentric direction, no longer because of Plato's view of the immortal soul, but largely because of the spectacular developments in both brain science and computing. Modern theories of mind have developed in parallel with technological growth. And the bleed over between evolutionary theory and tech jargon, which is seemingly so counterintuitive, in fact occurred early and remains dominant today. Brain processes are understood in terms of algorithms, inputs, outputs, problem-solving machines and the like. Tooby and Cosmides, who were very influential in this space, have said the brain is not just like a computer, it is a computer. That is a physical system that was designed to process information. Such insistence on identifying organic processes as digital ones has, ironically, tended to bring teleology or goal theory back into consideration. If humans or their brains really are computers, then they must have been designed or created as computers are to serve a purpose. Without venturing too far into these relevant debates, we may note that such a view of the human mind has been proven unsatisfactory for some. As Barrett et al. 2014 write, one reason why we might need an alternative to standard computational and representational theories of mind is because, despite claims to the contrary, it has yet to provide a complete account of how humans and other species produce adaptive, flexible behaviour in a dynamic, unpredictable world. In other words, the computer models of the mind, in formulations such as those of evolutionary psychology, have failed to account for the behaviour which is most centrally and importantly human. One alternative, identified by Barrett, is a less rigid account afforded by extended cognition, the variants of which have in common the idea that body and environment contribute to cognitive processes in a constitutive and not merely causal way. That is, they argue that an organism's cognitive system extends beyond the brain to encompass other bodily structures and processes. And some of the more influential theorists in this space include Andy Clark and David Chalmers, one of the first philosophers we studied in our course, with the extended mind thesis, the idea that we think not just with our brains, but with our bodies and with the world. It's a very appealing view. Such an account is far richer, taking account of the range of influences upon humans in the world afforded by education, culture, and relationships. And if we have to underscore the fact, computers, even though they may have training these days, can only simulate relationships. But of course, for students of Stoicism, such an extended account is nothing new. In the Stoic worldview, we are all members of an intimate network extending through place and time, acting and being acted upon in a complex causal matrix. One element of the causal web for the Stoics is disposition. Remember how Seneca said how Numa was disposed? Disposition, the way a thing is arranged, one factor in the causal mix. In this context, the work of Philip Goff, in conjecturing that even the most elementary particles may have some form of disposition, enabling a rudimentary agency, offers a tantalizing prospect. And that's in his book, which we studied at the start of the course, Why? The Purpose of the Universe. Seeing agency, life, in all the constituents of the world would answer the claim of Stephen Hawking, who says that even a final theory of physics wouldn't tell us what, quote, breathes fire into the equations and makes the universe for them to describe, quoted in Goff. Thus, we've come all the way back to the Stoic fiery breath, the pneuma, which would indeed fit the bill. And we've come back to CPR. While there is some literary evidence of the breath of life being applied to patients, in practice, resuscitation was only developed in various forms during the 19th century, and it was not until 1960 that CPR, as we now know it, was established as a routine practice. And the key reason for urgency in performing CPR is the dire impact of lack of oxygen on the brain. Even though our science these days is cephalocentric, we do not slap an unconscious patient around the head in the hope of reviving them. It is the heart and lungs, Aristotle's and the Stoics' mid-body, which prove in a crisis to be key to everything else, including brain function. In a crisis, we are all cardiocentrists now. Neuroscience continues to underscore how integrated are the heart and its associated features and functions with the brain and the rest of our body. The vagus nerve represents one important pathway between heart and brain. While many details remain obscure, there is communication in both directions, accompanying the sensations with which we may be familiar. And this graphic is from the Association of British Neurologists, a research project from 2022, stimulating the vagus nerve to help recover arm function in stroke patients. Thoughts and emotions can affect heart health and vice versa. Stress and grief can also have an impact. Brain and heart are engaged in profound, intimate dialogue, influencing our overall well-being. The gut too, once again, that key mid-body, is increasingly known to be linked to brain, mood, and overall health. The Stoics would not have been surprised. They might just have wondered why it has taken us so long to arrive at a holistic and balanced view of hearts, minds, and humans. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Please visit the collegeofstoicphilosophers.org for information on the college, e-journal, and course offerings. Till next time, pro Cauton.